It was just another ordinary night. But for Emily, it was another night of endless struggle. 7 months pregnant, Emily moved between the gas pumps, her thin uniform barely shielding her from the biting cold. Her worn-out jacket, zipped halfway up, did little to keep the chill from creeping into her bones. But she had no choice. She had to keep working. The sound of raindrops hitting the canopy above blended with the low hum of passing cars. Emily wiped the windshield of an impatient customer's vehicle, her hands numb from the cold. Her lower back ached, a constant reminder of the life growing inside her, but there was no time to slow down. The night shift at the gas station was her only source of income, and her rent was already overdue. A loud honk startled her. She quickly turned, realizing another customer was waiting. A man in a heavy coat barely acknowledged her as he shoved a few bills through the half-opened window of his truck. "Fill it up. And hurry," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Emily nodded politely, forcing a smile, and rushed to pump the gas. It was always the same. Customers came and went, treating her like she was nothing more than a machine, a service, an afterthought. Not a single one of them saw how exhausted she was. A few feet away, under the station's small awning, Sophia sat on a worn-out plastic chair, clutching her notebook tightly against her chest. At just 8 years old, she had already learned how to keep herself occupied while her mother worked. She hunched over her notebook, her small hands gripping a tiny red pencil that had been sharpened down to a stub. Beside her lay 2 other broken pencils, one blue, one yellow, the only ones she had left. But despite their condition, she kept drawing. Her notebook was filled with dreams sketched in careful lines, simple but detailed pictures of a kitchen, steaming pots, and a large wooden table. At the top of the page, in messy, uneven letters, she had written, "Mama's Place." It was a name she had imagined over and over again, a name for the restaurant her mother always talked about but never believed she could have. Then suddenly deep hum of an old vintage pickup truck rolled into the gas station, its headlights cutting through the thin veil of rain. The vehicle had a presence, much like the man behind the wheel. It wasn't flashy, nor was it loud, it was simply there, steady and solid, like a shadow of something greater. The truck came to a slow stop near the pumps, but the driver didn't step out immediately. Instead, inside the dimly lit cab, Clint Eastwood sat quietly for a moment, his weathered hands resting on the steering wheel. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the scene before him, taking in everything, the flickering neon lights, the empty streets, the faint mist of rain settling on the asphalt. Then, he saw her. A woman, heavily pregnant, moving from car to car, struggling under the weight of the gas pump. Her uniform, thin and damp, clung to her body, offering little protection from the cold. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached up to clean a windshield, exhaustion written in every movement she made. And yet, she kept going, her shoulders squared with quiet determination. Clint's jaw tightened. He had seen people like her before, fighters. People who didn't complain, who didn't ask for help, even when they clearly needed it. People who carried their burdens alone, not because they wanted to, but because life had given them no other choice. Then, his eyes shifted slightly. A few feet away, under the small awning of the station, a little girl sat on a faded plastic chair, her head bent over a notebook balanced on her lap. She was drawing, lost in her own world, her tiny fingers wrapped around a short, broken red pencil. Beside her lay a few other pencils, all worn down to stubs, barely enough to color with. And yet, she kept going. Intrigued, Clint pushed open the truck door and stepped out, the heels of his cowboy boots clicking softly against the wet pavement. His movement was slow, deliberate, not the kind of hesitation that comes from uncertainty, but the kind that comes from experience. As he walked closer, the rain tapped lightly against the brim of his dark cowboy hat, casting a faint shadow over his face. The little girl didn't notice him at first. She was too focused, her small hand carefully shading a sign above a sketch of a restaurant. The sign, written in clumsy, uneven letters, read, "Mama's Place." Clint stopped a few feet away, watching her work. Then, in that calm, gravelly voice, he finally spoke. "What are you drawin', kid?" The sudden sound of his voice made Sophia pause. She looked up, eyes wide with curiosity, gripping her tiny pencil a little tighter. For a moment, she hesitated. Strangers rarely spoke to her, especially ones who looked like Clint Eastwood, tall, serious, with a face that looked like it had seen more than its share of hard days. But there was something different about him. Something calm. Something that didn't make her feel like she had to shrink into herself. She swallowed nervously and glanced down at her drawing. "A restaurant," she said softly. "My mama wants one." Clint's sharp eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the weight of those words. He crouched slightly, just enough to be at eye level with the notebook, but he didn't crowd her. "Yeah," he said, tilting his head slightly. "What kind of place?" Sophia shifted in her chair, still holding the pencil tightly. "A nice place. Where people come and eat together. And talk. And they're happy." Clint nodded slowly, his gaze still on the sketch. The kitchen she had drawn was simple, but there was love in every detail. The pots on the stove, the chairs around the table, it was a picture of warmth, of home. The kind of place that Emily had probably dreamed of long before life took her down a different road. Before Clint could say anything else, Emily's voice cut through the quiet. "She's not bothering you, is she, sir?" Her tone was polite, but there was a thin layer of worry beneath it. She approached quickly, wiping her hands on her uniform, her movements weary but protective. Clint turned his gaze up toward her, standing to his full height. "Not at all," he said, shaking his head slightly. "She's got a good imagination." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She took a moment to study the man in front of her, noticing his rough, weathered hands, his piercing yet steady gaze. There was something about him, a quiet authority, the kind of presence that demanded respect without ever having to ask for it. And yet, despite his hardened exterior, his voice carried something else. Kindness. But Emily didn't trust kindness easily. Life had taught her that people rarely did things without expecting something in return. She placed a gentle hand on Sophia's shoulder, as if silently reminding her daughter to be cautious. Clint noticed, but he didn't take offense. He understood that kind of hesitation, the kind that only came from someone who had been let down too many times before. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to fall, the sound of it soft against the awning above them. Then, Clint glanced back at Sophia's notebook one last time, nodding to himself. He had seen enough. Without another word, he adjusted his jacket and took a step back, but something in his expression had changed. He wasn't just passing through anymore. Something about this night, about this woman and her daughter, had stirred something in him. And he wasn't going to just walk away. Not yet. Because Clint Eastwood wasn't the kind of man who ignored things that needed fixing. And this? This was something that needed fixing. The gas station was quiet except for the occasional splash of rain against the pavement and the distant hum of traffic. Clint Eastwood stood near Sophia, still watching, still observing. His sharp eyes followed Emily as she wiped her hands on a thin, stained rag, her breath visible in the cold air. Then, suddenly, a loud, impatient honk shattered the silence. Emily flinched, her tired body instinctively reacting to the sound. At the far pump, a customer, a middle-aged man in a warm, expensive coat, leaned on his car horn again, scowling. "Hello? Some service here," he called out, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. His expression was one of complete indifference, as if he didn't see Emily as a person, just a worker meant to serve him. Emily took a deep breath, her exhaustion plain on her face, but still, she forced herself to move quickly. Her hand instinctively pressed against her lower back, as if she were trying to hold herself together. But Clint saw it, the slight tremble in her fingers, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of her pregnancy. As she hurried toward the man's car, Clint followed her with his gaze. Emily reached for the pump, struggling for a second before gripping it tightly and starting to fill the customer's tank. "Took you long enough," the man muttered, scrolling through his phone. He didn't even look at her. Emily said nothing. She was used to this. When she finished pumping the gas, she moved to clean the windshield. It was part of her job, but her hands shook slightly as she reached up. The cold had made them numb, and the long hours had drained the last bit of strength from her limbs. Clint saw it all. The limp in her right leg, the wetness soaking into her worn-out shoes, the way her breath hitched as she tried to stretch just a little further. She was struggling, but she never once complained. The man in the car barely acknowledged her efforts. When she finished, he tossed a few coins onto the ground instead of handing them to her. "That's for you," he said dismissively, rolling up his window. Emily just stood there for a moment, staring at the coins on the wet pavement. Clint's jaw tightened. She bent down slowly, struggling against the weight of her belly, picking up the scattered change with shaking fingers. Something in Clint's chest burned, not just anger, but something deeper. Disgust. Frustration. Recognition. How many times had he seen hardworking people treated like this? How many times had the world looked away from someone who clearly needed help? Emily straightened herself and walked back to the station counter. She placed the coins in the cash register as if they actually mattered, her fingers rubbing together, trying to find warmth. That's when Clint finally spoke. "You do this every night?" His voice was low, steady, but there was something weighted in his tone, something that made Emily pause before answering. She sighed, brushing damp hair out of her face. "2 nights a week here. Mornings I clean offices." Clint was quiet for a moment, letting those words settle. Then he asked, "And when do you rest?" Emily let out a small, tired laugh, but there was no humor in it. Just exhaustion. "I don't," she admitted. "Bills don't wait, and the baby won't either." She placed a protective hand over her stomach without thinking. Clint studied her, his expression unreadable. He had met a lot of people in his lifetime, fighters, survivors, people who had nothing but still pushed forward. Emily was one of them. Sophia, still sitting under the awning, had been listening quietly the whole time. She reached over and squeezed her mother's hand, a small but powerful gesture. "Mama, you're always tired," Sophia said softly. Emily glanced down at her daughter, trying to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart." But Clint saw through that lie. He glanced at Sophia's notebook again, at the carefully drawn kitchen with its steaming pots and inviting table. The dream Emily had once had. The dream she had buried under exhaustion, responsibility, and survival. Clint exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his stubbled jaw. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things should be. And no, he wasn't some kind of hero, but he wasn't the kind of man to ignore something that needed fixing either. He turned back to Emily. "You like to cook?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was an edge of something else beneath it. Something purposeful. Emily frowned, caught off guard by the question. "I used to," she admitted after a pause. "Before, life got in the way." Clint nodded slowly, tucking his hands into his jacket pockets. He had seen enough. He made a decision, right there, standing under the dim glow of the gas station's neon lights. Tomorrow, he'd come back. And he was going to change something for this woman and her daughter. Whether she was ready for it or not. Clint stood there for a moment, watching Emily as she rubbed her aching back, exhaustion written all over her face. The weight she carried, both physically and emotionally, was clear. He nodded slowly, as if making a decision. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his old pickup truck. The leather of his jacket creaked slightly as he moved, his boots making soft thuds against the wet pavement. He opened the passenger door and reached inside. A moment later, he returned, carrying two things. One was a fresh, unopened box of colored pencils, the kind with bright, vibrant colors, neatly packed, untouched. The other was a sealed envelope. He walked past Emily and stopped in front of Sophia. The little girl looked up, her small hand still clutching the tiny, worn-out red pencil she had been using. Clint crouched down so he was at her eye level, holding out the new colored pencils. "A kid should always have the right tools to dream," he said, his deep, gravelly voice softer now. Sophia blinked in surprise. Her eyes widened in delight as she reached out carefully, as if she couldn't believe it was real. She ran her tiny fingers over the smooth box, her expression filled with pure wonder and gratitude. "Thank you, mister," she exclaimed, hugging the pencils to her chest like they were treasure. Clint simply nodded, a small, barely there smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Then, he stood up and turned to Emily. She was watching the exchange, her face filled with both appreciation and hesitation. Clint reached out and placed the sealed envelope on the counter in front of her. Emily hesitated, glancing between him and the envelope. "What's this?" she asked, her voice cautious. Clint met her gaze, his expression unreadable but firm. "It's a little push," he said simply. "Rent for this month. You don't owe me anything." Emily's breath hitched. She didn't even open the envelope, she already knew what was inside. She could feel the lump forming in her throat. "Sir, I can't take this," she stammered, shaking her head. "I don't even know you." Clint's gaze didn't waver. "Ain't charity," he said, his voice steady. "Just helpin' someone who deserves better." Emily stared at him in disbelief. No one had ever done something like this for her. Not without expecting something in return. She wanted to refuse. She had spent so long fighting on her own, pushing through, surviving. Taking help felt foreign, almost wrong. But then she glanced down at Sophia, who was still holding onto the box of colored pencils, grinning ear to ear. And something inside her shifted. Before she could say anything, Clint reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it beside the envelope. Emily hesitated before unfolding it. It was a flyer, for a free culinary course. She blinked, rereading the words, her fingers tightening around the edges. "That's for you," Clint said, nodding toward Sophia's drawing. "You ever thought of cookin' for a livin'?" Emily's lips parted slightly, but no words came. She looked down at the flyer, her mind racing. She had dreamed of this once, before life got too hard, before bills piled up, before she was left alone to raise Sophia and carry another child. She had buried that dream long ago. And yet, here it was. Being handed back to her. Her eyes welled with tears she didn't want to shed. She swallowed hard and looked up at Clint, struggling to understand why he was doing this. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint studied her for a long moment before finally answering. "Because you deserve more than just surviving." Clint Eastwood stood in silence, his gaze steady as he took in the sight before him, Emily, worn down by exhaustion but still pushing forward, and Sophia, a bright child with big dreams but few tools to bring them to life. He exhaled slowly, nodding to himself as if making a decision. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back to his truck. Emily watched him go, her brow furrowing in confusion. He had been standing there, watching, asking questions, and now he was just leaving? She shook her head, ready to move on with her shift, when she heard the sound of his truck door opening and closing again. Clint was coming back. And he wasn't empty-handed. In one hand, he carried a fresh, unopened box of colored pencils. In the other, a small sealed envelope. He strode over to where Sophia sat, her tiny hands still clutching the stub of her red pencil. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. Without kneeling completely, Clint crouched down slightly to meet her at eye level and held out the box. "A kid should always have the right tools to dream," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. Sophia blinked, then gasped. "Pencils," she whispered, her excitement barely contained. She reached out hesitantly, looking at her mother for permission. Emily, still caught off guard, nodded slightly, and Sophia eagerly grabbed the box, holding it like it was the greatest treasure in the world. She ran her fingers over the bright, colorful packaging before looking back up at Clint with pure joy in her eyes. "Thank you, mister," she beamed. Clint gave her a small, approving nod before standing up and turning to Emily. He placed the envelope on the counter in front of her. Emily stared at it, hesitant. "What's this?" she asked, her voice wary. Clint adjusted his jacket, his expression as unreadable as ever. "It's a little push." Emily hesitated, then slowly picked up the envelope. The weight of it told her exactly what was inside even before she opened it. She flipped up the flap, just enough to see the stack of crisp bills tucked neatly inside. Her breath hitched. "Sir, I can't take this," she stammered, looking up at him, her hands trembling slightly. Clint's eyes didn't waver. "Ain't charity," he said simply. "Just helpin' someone who deserves better." Emily swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent years struggling alone, never asking for handouts, never expecting kindness from strangers. And yet, here stood this man, offering not pity, but a chance. Before she could find the words to thank him, Clint pulled a small folded paper from his pocket and placed it beside the envelope. Emily, still struggling to process what was happening, picked it up and unfolded it. It was a flyer for a free culinary course. She stared at it, blinking in shock. "That's for you." Clint nodded toward the drawing Sophia had been working on, the one with Mama's Place scribbled at the top. "You ever thought of cookin' for a livin'?" Emily's eyes welled with tears, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. For the first time in a long time, she saw a door opening in front of her. She had spent so long just trying to survive that she had forgotten what it felt like to hope. But now, because of this stranger's simple yet profound kindness, she had a chance. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The town had changed with the seasons. The cold rain that had once soaked the pavement at the gas station had been replaced with warm sunlight that bathed the streets in a golden glow. Clint Eastwood hadn't been back in months, but when he drove through town again, something caught his eye. A small cafe on the corner. The once empty storefront now had a fresh coat of paint, warm lighting, and a sign that made him slow his truck to a stop. Above the door, in bold, welcoming letters, was the name. Mama's Place, Home Cooking with Heart. Clint's sharp eyes lingered on the sign for a moment, then he smirked. She did it. He parked his truck and stepped inside. The moment he pushed open the door, he was met with the rich, comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and homemade lasagna. The air was warm and inviting, filled with the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of plates. It was a small place, nothing fancy, but it had soul. And then, a familiar voice rang out. "Mama! Look!" From behind the counter, Sophia came running toward him, her face lit up with excitement. She skidded to a stop in front of him, grinning from ear to ear. "Mama made her dream come true," she exclaimed. Clint looked down at her, taking in the bright, happy eyes of a child who had seen struggle, but had also seen hope. Before he could respond, Emily appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. A real apron. Not a gas station uniform. Not an office cleaning rag. A real apron. She froze when she saw Clint, her eyes widening. Then, a slow, proud smile spread across her face. "Never thought I'd see this day," she admitted, looking around at the bustling cafe. Clint, as always, kept his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes softened. "Told you, kid." He glanced at the sign above them. "Some dreams just need a push." Emily chuckled, shaking her head as if still unable to believe this was real. "I don't know how to thank you." Clint gave a slight smirk. "You already did." Then, without another word, he walked to an empty seat in the corner, the perfect spot to watch a dream in motion. Emily nodded to Sophia, and with a grin, the little girl ran to the kitchen. Moments later, she returned, proudly placing a steaming plate of homemade lasagna in front of Clint. He picked up a fork, took a slow bite, then gave a small approving nod. "Not bad." Emily laughed, shaking her head. "I'll take that as the highest compliment." Clint simply ate in silence, watching as Emily worked her dream into reality, plate by plate. A quiet satisfaction settled over him. Because he had done what he had come to do. He had given a small push. And in the end, it had been enough to change everything.